want to say thank you for hitting play on this episode of Politics Not Included. I have just one thing to ask of you as you listen to this conversation. The goal of this show is to start bringing the humanity back to politics. And in order to do that, I need you to listen to this person's perspective with an open mind. This season, we're going to hear from candidates on both sides of the party aisle, as well as independent candidates. And I'm hoping that through these conversations, you'll get to know the people behind the campaigns and get to know the people that will appear on your ballot in August and again in November. And if you have something that you feel like you want to say that you wouldn't say if you were sitting in this room with us, I'm going to ask you to keep it out of the comments. We're here to genuinely get to understand somebody's journey and perspective. In order to accomplish the goal of this podcast, we need to go into this with an open mind and avoid attacking one another. Now, let's get this show started, and I'm excited to introduce you to the person that you'll get to know a little bit better today. Just one note before we get started with today's episode. All candidates have been invited to appear as a guest on Politics Not Included. On today's episode of Politics Not Included, I'm joined by Cindy Holscher, who is one of the Democratic candidates for governor in the 2026 election cycle. Senator Holscher, welcome to Politics Not Included.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm excited to break down your prior legislative experience in your career and kind of break down those experiences and then what led you to run for governor and what that experience is like for you now. But to get us started, you're running a statewide campaign. So what excites you most about traveling the state and running for governor?
Oh, really just getting out there and talking with people, listening to their stories, hearing about their background and why they love Kansas and, for some of them, why they came to this state, why they picked it. And really, again, just hearing their stories and what they want for the future and what their focus is. So I just really enjoy that. Some of these are new faces, some of these are familiar faces as I go across the state. But what I enjoy too is just seeing, we have families out there and people out there just working hard and doing their best. And really, they're just a constant reminder of why I went into public service.
And I'm going to try to break down your prior legislative experience. Please correct me if I'm wrong. You served 2 terms in the Kansas House of Representatives, representing District 16 from 2017 to 2021, or was that 2016 to 2021?
Well, I ran for office in 2016, assumed office in 2017.
In 2017. Okay. And then after that, you were elected to the Kansas Senate, representing District 8 from beginning in 2021, and you're currently in your 2nd term as a Kansas senator.
Correct.
And so that is kind of your background as a legislator. I want to break that down and some of those experiences, but before we get into that, what was your life like before you decided to run for office, and why even run for office in the first place?
Yeah, I have degrees in political science and journalism. So upon graduating from college, I went to work in that field, spent over 12 years working at Sprint. And while I was there for a time frame, I actually worked on developing and implementing budgets, which is very pertinent to the work that is done in the governor's office. And, this is for departments and for functions larger than the state of Kansas in terms of the financial aspect. Part of my time also at Sprint then was spent in marketing, where I focused on product development and creating new revenue streams and new jobs and managing very large teams, which that too is obviously very pertinent to the job of governor. For a time period there, then I actually stayed home raising kids. I have 3 children. At one point, I had 3 kids under the age of 4. So, like I said, took a few years off with them. And then once they got into grade school, I was a frequent volunteer at their grade school, ran the PTA, and that is where I was seeing firsthand what was happening under the Brownback experiment, which was basically these massive tax cuts to the upper bracket. And as a result, all of our programs in our schools were having drastic budget cuts. So like I said, from that time frame, I was able to see what the Brownback experiment was doing in terms of really hurting our public schools and other services. So that eventually then led me to run for office.
And what was that first? So now you've run several campaigns, so you have experiences running a campaign. What was that first experience like for you? Like it's a lot of, I imagine drinking from a fire hose and just trying to figure out how to contact people and like, how has that evolved for you over time?
Yeah, well, at that point, we didn't have a real good structure in place in terms of volunteers or precinct leaders. So the good news was, though, that I had a pretty close base of friends and some people who had been involved in some prior campaigns for school board, and they helped me out tremendously. So we got through that first campaign in terms of having a pretty coherent structure. And then honestly, what we did at that point is we took that structure and built upon it here in Johnson County, because when I was first elected to office, there were only 5 Democrats out of 36 elected to the legislature. And then from that, we built upon, like I said, kind of this foundation that we had established. And in an 8-year period, we have gone from 5 Democrats to 17 elected to the legislature. So we've had some pretty rapid growth with, like I said, the structure that we have put together. And I'm excited about the thought of, as governor, taking that growth mindset and that strategy across the state to help other parts grow.
I find it really fascinating because on its surface, it's just I need to get my name out there, but that's easier said on paper than it is an actual concept of spreading your word and your message. And I guess in a bigger context, you've had success in the Kansas House and now in the Kansas Senate. How do you make decisions on going from you've had success in the Kansas House twice, now I want to move and try to expand my reach a little bit to the Kansas Senate, and now you're running for governor? Like, what are those decisions like for you in making some changes in what you're running for and kind of like logistics around that?
Yeah, it's always been a matter of, you know, what can I do to help the state?
Hmm.
At the time when I first ran for office, my own representative was leading the charge on trying to defund our public schools. So there was somebody there that, like I said, there was a path there in terms of, needing to stop that activity. So, like I said, that was what motivated me to run for that office. Crossing over to Senate, kind of the same thing. The person who was my senator at the time was very much an obstructionist, didn't want good bills to move forward. So that's what motivated me in that regard. Now we're looking at this governor's race where there's just almost a dozen very, very extreme Republicans who have lined up to run. And, with the legislature the way it is currently, there's a supermajority of extremists. If one of those Republicans becomes elected with their extreme agenda, our state's in trouble. So I am compelled to run because, I've put in nearly a decade of work trying to save our schools and save our state. And like I said, that MAGA agenda would be disastrous for us. So that is what compels me to run, because after working for almost 10 years, trying to get us on, a solid path where children have access to good schools, I don't want to hand the reins over and have everything essentially destroyed.
So for you, it sounds like you see a problem that you can address, and so you then go after, I'm going to put myself in that position to make the most impact for yourself or for the things that you believe in and you believe your constituents believe in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was my daughter, honestly, who motivated me to run when we saw the problem of what was going on out there. And again, under the Brownback experiment, when our schools were being defunded, one weekend we went into Target. She was about 12 years old at the time, and she saw one of her teachers working there on the weekend. And she asked me,
Um,
she's like, why is my teacher working here after being at school all week? And I explained to her, I said, well, we're in this budget crisis. She probably doesn't make enough money to pay her bills, and she has to have a second job. And my daughter was so offended by that. And she looked at me and she said, you go fix that. That's wrong. And I started to think about, it's going to take reasonable people stepping forward to fix things. So that's what led me to run in the first place. And that's what has kept me going in terms of, there are issues and there are problems that need to be addressed. And it's going to take reasonable people stepping forward to fix those things.
I love that. And I love the family support that you have. It sounds like you have a very
Oh
strong
yeah,
daughter that sees a problem and also wants to address it. And I love that that was kind of your initial inspiration in it. And I do want to circle back to your family at some point, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes
sure.
in their role in you running for governor. But before we move into that, running a campaign and things I often think about are like failure that you've had very successful runs for office. Has there ever been a point in your mind where you think, like for governor, for example, I'm going for the highest office in the state of Kansas. Does failure ever cross your mind, or are you just like really passionate about going for it? Like, how do you mentally handle that in a very public, it's very public what you're doing?
Oh yeah, yeah. You know, no matter the outcome, I feel like there's success in the terms of I'm getting people involved who haven't been before. We're energizing some potential voters out there who haven't been consistent voters. Maybe they've only voted every 4 or 6 years, but now they're seeing that they have to be more involved more consistently. So that's going to be great for the state moving forward, regardless. But the best thing is I've been talking to Kansans and listening to Kansans all across the state, and I always do this. I always run like I'm behind. Yet the fact of the matter is, I'm 20 points ahead in the polls, ahead of my closest opponent in the primary. So that does tell me that my message is resonating, that, that I'm on the same page as the voters in terms of what's important to them. And of course, with every election, I leave it all out on the field. I give it 150% and more. So that's what I'm doing this time around too.
Mhm. It sounds like that the small wins also are driving you forward too, like interactions with people and
Oh
getting people to
yeah.
the polls that wouldn't normally do it. And I think that is also something that's really important to hold on to drive you forward in a goal that is it's a big goal to find, small steps along the way.
Oh yeah, of course you want to get voters out who are consistent voters, but it feels like a big victory every time you talk to someone and they say, I haven't voted before, or, last time I voted was 7 or 8 years ago and now I'm going to get out this time. Like I said, yeah, that feels like a big win.
And one more thing before we move on to another topic, just in terms of your legislative experience, that there are some people that have the opinion that in order to be successful as a governor and also to be elected as governor, you have to have prior legislative experience, which you do. And then there are other people that have the opinion that the longer you're in office, the further you get from constituents and fall more into like the career politician category. How do you think that your prior legislative experience plays into running for governor, and what's your take on like, having experience running for governor, and what would you say to people that think that you have maybe too much experience?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think it's important that you have some experience and obviously that, you're able to navigate the waters, so to speak. I've been told I'm one of the most successful Democrats in terms of getting bills that I've introduced to the finish line, and it's hard to do as a member of the super minority when you have this large base of often very extreme Republicans. But maybe it's because of my background, being from the farm, being from a military family and a union family. There's a lot of points of commonality, so that has helped me in terms of potentially getting people on board with legislation that I'm working on. And that's helped me too in this campaign. But like I said, I think it is helpful to have that experience to be able to navigate those waters. I will tell you too, I do believe that there is something in terms of, being under the dome too much. And, you have lobbyists there, you have these special interest groups that are always trying to work on you. And I'll tell you this, in 9 years in the legislature, I've only stayed overnight in Topeka one night. And part of that is because, when I first started this, my kids were smaller. But additionally, I think it's very important to be back in my community. And I know some people can't do that because of logistics and where they're located or where they're from. And it's an hour drive for me, so it's a little bit burdensome. But again, by the same token, I think it's important to kind of break away from that environment because you're there all day. again with special interest groups and lobbyists who are in your ears. And then if you're there in the evening, there's receptions and things going on, and you have a lot of those same people, talking
Mhm.
to you and working on you. So, like I said, I think it's just so important to break away from that. And that's why, I'm very mindful of making sure that I'm doing town halls in communities that I'm spending time in my neighborhoods, knocking doors, even if it's not an election cycle, because you've got to stay connected to the people because that's who you serve, not those special interest groups and not the lobbyist.
When you're in session for, is it 4 months?
Yeah, it's
About,
supposed to be like mid-January to the end of May, roughly.
okay. What does the rest of the year look like for you in a, let's say in a non-campaigning year? What's the rest of that year look like for you?
Yeah, well, a couple of years ago, due to the shortage of teachers after COVID, I went out and got my sub license because I'm a huge public school advocate. I actually, prior to entering the legislature to draw attention to the underfunding of our schools, I actually literally walked from Shawnee, Kansas to Topeka twice with a group of parent activists to draw attention to the underfunding. And as a result, we were able to get some more reasonable people elected back in 2016, which helped us in the Brownback experiment. So, like I said, I've always been a big advocate for our schools. And honestly, I'm probably the best poster child in terms of it was public education and a good union job that helped my family be propelled out of poverty. And I feel so strongly about what the public schools have meant to my three kids and what these teachers have poured into my children to help them, be good citizens and grow up to be successful. So, like I said, after the COVID and we had this teacher shortage, I felt compelled to do what I could in my community to help. So I got my substitute license. And so in that part of the year when we weren't in session, I was working pretty much 4 and 5 days a week in local schools, trying to help out in that regard. And then, of course, still doing town halls and some of those other things. But like I said, just trying to do everything I can to help my communities.
I imagine that that experience also helps you stay connected with your community too, like engaging with parents and other teachers and things like that. I assume people around you know that you're a legislator and also a substitute teacher. Do you get people approaching you differently, or do you feel like you really just kind of fly under the radar in those experiences?
It's funny, like sometimes when I'm subbing, some of the kids will be like, I know I know you, and sometimes they can't figure out exactly who I am. And then sometimes I'll just kind of say, well, I work for the government. And it's funny because some of them automatically go, oh, you're a spy.
A
So
Kansas
I'm like, no,
spy.
I'm not a spy. But then I just don't correct them and let them, let them think of
Yeah.
it that way. And then they
Yeah.
behave really well.
Yeah, I imagine if they think you're a spy, you have all those sorts of skills.
Yeah.
And what does, so this year running for governor, I know you're in session, so I imagine you have very limited time, and I imagine you have a team surrounding you. But how does running for governor fit into also being a Kansas senator?
Yeah. You know, my days at Sprint, and even before that, lots of time management skills employed, I guess is the best way to
Hmm.
answer that. And obviously being a mom and, you learn to be a huge multitasker. So, I guess the good news is this too. My youngest graduated high school last year, so we're technically empty nesters. I'm
Yeah.
pretty much in control of my schedule at this point. So,
Hmm.
I've got my schedule in terms of being in Topeka and doing my legislative work, and then the off hours are pretty much dedicated to campaigning and doing what I need to do to make sure I'm reaching out to constituents across the state.
Yeah, it sounds like you're juggling a lot of things. And if there's somebody listening to this that doesn't know who you are and asks the question, what kind of leader is Cindy Holscher? How would you answer that question?
Oh, I'm the kind of leader that's going to listen. I'm going to listen to my constituents. I'm going to listen to the subject matter experts. And I'm going to put people first. And before I vote on any bill That is at the heart of it. Does this
Mhm.
benefit the people? And if it does, then I'm going to vote for it and support it. Support it. If it doesn't, then it's not going to gain my support.
Mhm. And if you were elected as governor, what would you want the tone or culture of your administration to feel like?
Yeah, this is what people can count on. It'll be an administration that is responsive to the communities that we serve in Kansas. I want people to know that common sense solutions are going to be the focus, as always. Not culture wars, and certainly not giveaways to billionaires. And I work to make sure it's a very transparent office that's honest and accessible to the people. And I want to make sure that people know that we are going to use taxpayer dollars to make life easier for Kansas families, and that's what's going to be the focus.
Mhm. And I do want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your family. Running for office, any office, is a huge commitment, and running for governor, I think, is an even larger commitment, both personally and professionally. And I want to talk a little bit about how your family fits into that. You've already mentioned your daughter being the person that encouraged you to run for office the first time, so it sounds like your family is very supportive of it. But first, can you tell us a little bit about your family? You said you had three kids and just what your family's like.
Yeah, so my husband and I have been married 33 years, and yeah, we have three children. The youngest, like I said, just graduated high school. My oldest just graduated college, and then my daughter in between, still in college. So, like I said, my oldest just graduated college about a year ago and is now back in the area working. So, she's an engineer, just like my husband. My middle one is studying actuarial science right now, so we'll see how that goes. That's a tough area. And
Sure.
my youngest looks like he's studying engineering, so it looks like I'm going to be inundated with engineers here. So, but that's all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, that's how I feel. My parents are engineers too, so
Yeah,
I understand
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And
So and they've all been very very supportive. Yeah, like I said, my oldest was the one who basically kind of pushed me forward to run. And it's been a team effort in terms of the family and what they've brought to each campaign. My oldest has gone out knocking doors with me. Even that very first campaign when she was 12 and 13 years old, she would be out with me often 2 or 3 evenings a week, and then on weekends. The other two, not quite that aggressive. Hasn't always been their thing. Um, but at different times, they have pitched in, whether it be assembling signs or helping do other things. Now, my daughter Maddie on this campaign has been doing some of the social media and doing a lot of the work on TikTok. So that's been exciting for her. So that's kind of been her niche. My son, like I said, signs tend to be his thing, and that's where he'll pitch in.
that's great. You have it sounds like they all have their own kind of lane that they like to contribute and
Yeah.
help in. And I imagine it's really powerful for them to see you as their mom going for the things that you're really passionate about. So it's incredible that they are helping in that aspect too.
Oh,
Were
yeah, it's
there
good.
Were there any specific conversations that you had to have with them in terms of running for governor? I mean, it sounds like they're supportive, but when you were initially thinking, like, I want to run for governor, were there conversations that you had to get your family on board?
Yeah, when I first ran, they were pretty young. And I guess they've kind of become accustomed to some of the negatives, unfortunately, that come with this. I mean, we've had to up the security on our house a few different times just because of the nature of, the environment in terms of politically kind of what happens out there. Um, you know, I I can't say it was a long conversation in the respect that I think the same thing. They saw the need too. I mean, they understand what's at stake here in terms of where we are, in terms of, what's happening on the federal level, and where we are on the state level, and what this election means. And they understand the consequences. So, like I said, I don't feel like it was a very long conversation. It was more of, yeah, we've got to save the state.
Just a really quick interruption from the conversation that I hope you're enjoying. If you want to hear more of these conversations in the future, please consider hitting the follow or subscribe button in whatever platform you are listening or watching this episode. Just that one click of the button really helps us expand and grow the show. Thank you. And do you feel like there have been things as you're running for governor in this election cycle that you've had to say no to personally in order to commit to and run for governor?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of times you get a lot of invitations that you just can't do them all, or it becomes where they're duplicates. And, especially since I'm in session too, I've got to really, really manage my time to make sure that I'm, keeping those things first because we've got a lot of bills that are being worked, a lot of activity there, a lot of committee work. So, but people are, overall pretty understanding in those terms that, I've got to stay focused to those things, and that when it comes to, those other activities, that I've got to manage my time in a way to make sure that it has the biggest impact in the best way possible.
And in terms of being in session, I mean, this is something that I didn't know. I'm learning more about the political realm in the past couple of years and building this organization, but I didn't understand what it meant to be in session. For somebody that may be listening to this that is really not familiar with what that looks like, can you just outline like what a normal day in session looks like for you? Like what time do you leave your house to have to get there, and what time do you get to go home, and those types
Yeah.
of things. I think it's a little bit vague for most people.
Sure, sure. Well, normally session runs from around mid-January to the end of May. This session is very compressed. And we're supposed to be out in a couple weeks, honestly, in early April. So typically, I would be leaving my house around 7 or 7:15 in the morning. Get to Topeka. Committee work starts at 8:30, and usually it's back-to-back committee meetings. Like I'm in public health from 8:30 to 9:30. Then I go to Doge committee, which is 9:30 to 10:30, and then the next committee, Ways and Means, the Appropriations Committee or Budget Committee, then from like 10:30 to 11:30 or noon. A little break there. Although I say it's a break, but normally I have appointments with constituents or people who want to come talk to me about bills. I usually do that from 12 to 1:30. 1:30 back in committee work. Usually I have utilities committee from 1:30 to 2:30, then back on the floor at 2:30, and that's when we're debating bills actively. That session, can be an hour, it can be 2 hours, it can be 8 or 9 hours, just depending upon the time frame of the year. The past couple weeks, we've been working dozens of bills daily on the floor. So we're just at that point in the session where there's a lot of work happening. So, on a more normal day, I might get home about 6 or 7 o'clock. Lately because of the volume of bills we're working, it might be 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And usually what I'm doing on the way home, if it's within decent hours, I'm making phone calls to reach out to potential constituents, talking about the upcoming campaign, just trying to maximize every minute possible throughout the day. And then on weekends, sometimes I have town halls, and otherwise then I'm trying to, like I said, kind of focused to campaign activity on the weekend, but it's pretty busy to say the least.
Yeah, it sounds like sleep may be something that you're fighting for if you're talking about
Yeah.
getting home like 9 or 10 p.m.
That'll happen later.
Yeah, that'll happen later after the election is over.
Yeah.
And I've always been curious about this, and I feel like you're a great person to ask in terms of like getting on committees. Are those things that you're volunteering for? Are you being like appointed to those? And then in terms of bills going to the floor, how does that process? Could you just briefly explain
Sure.
like what that looks like?
Yeah, in terms of committees after an election cycle, essentially each of us basically kind of list out or which committees we would like to be on and kind of prioritize, like I would make a list of 5 or 6 of the committees, essentially which one's my top preference, and if there's reasons why, maybe I have experience in a certain area that I point out that is pertinent. So and then that gets submitted to leadership, and from there it's determined who's assigned to which committees. And you might get several of the committees you want, you might not, but like I said, that's how that's determined. And then in terms of bills and which bills are worked, that really comes down to the majority party. I mean, they really have the power in determining which bills get hearings and which bills move forward. So, it can be kind of frustrating being in the super minority because you can bring forward some great bills and they may not be chosen for a hearing and may not move forward. So you have to then, as a member of the Democratic Party, then look for those opportunities to help get your bills, move forward, either through really, really, you know, working with your committee chairs and leadership to try to, get hearings scheduled, or bring it forward as an amendment on the floor to another bill. But like I said, that is the thing with the majority party. They have a lot of power in deciding which bills get moved forward in this process.
Mhm. And what would you say to somebody that may be listening that has something that they're passionate about that they want to talk to a legislator? Like, what would your advice be? Like, let's say it's one of your constituents that has something that they're passionate about. What would you say to that person in terms of like reaching out in order to
Oh,
have their voice heard?
yeah, I mean, you can always reach out to your legislators directly by calling or emailing. It's a little harder to visit the Capitol, but people can do that. If there's a particular bill that people are interested in, it's always great to testify, and you don't have to come to Topeka to do that. You can do it virtually, so that's a great, mode of access. But the other thing I tell people is if there's a specific topic that a person is very passionate about, there's a lot of organizations out there that can help amplify your voice. And I think of organizations like Moms Demand Action, if you're passionate about that area in terms of reasonable gun laws, they help amplify people's voices. Or, there's groups like here in our area, we have Game On for Kansas Schools. That's a group that fights for our public schools. And again, that's another way to amplify your voice. So there's different organizations like that that depend upon your interests, have a presence in the Capitol, and can really help advocate on certain issues. And so I always recommend those too.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good perspective. And to shift gears a little bit, I want to talk about social media and just like public perception of somebody as an elected official. That I know you have a very active social media page. Like I follow your page and see how often you post, and people comment on posts and depending on the topic, some of the comments can be aggressive. Like, I mean, there's a difference in somebody that is genuinely wanting to discuss something and has opposing views versus somebody that is just hateful and wants to say bad things to vent a little bit. How do you handle, I mean, social media is a part of campaigning now. It's something that people go to. How do you handle comments on social media and just in general some of the negative opinions? You mentioned having to have security, like additional security at your home. How do you
Mhm.
handle that part of running for office?
Yeah. I mean, I don't look at it a whole lot, but when I do look at it, I mean, I don't know. I pass right by it. And, some of them, like, are the same people over and over again. And I don't know. I guess I just have really thick skin because, um, it honestly, unless they're making threats or whatever, like I said, it just doesn't really bother me. And honestly, and, you know, 10 years of doing this, the only times I've really had huge issues was, like I said, when people have, really threatened something. Or there have been a couple of times people use such intense profanity that I was concerned about like younger audiences on my social media. That's like, okay, you can't do that.
Mhm.
The kind of words they were using. But honestly, you know, overall response is positive, and I always remember too, for every negative comment out there, there's usually 10 people who think positive that aren't taking time to say something. So and
Mhm.
my elections have shown that. So like I said, I just typically scroll on past that.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing that it seems like the average, the people that may be supportive or don't have super strong opinions, but maybe they're a supporter or or not. You typically don't hear from people in the middle. You
Oh
hear
yeah.
from the people on the extreme. So it's kind of sometimes it's easy to get lost in like that one or two negative comment or the positive comment. So it's kind of refreshing to hear like, oh, I just kind of scroll past it or take it with a grain of salt when it could be easy to like go down that vortex of negative
Yeah.
comments.
Well, and yeah, to that point, I mean, a person with a complaint is more likely to say something than people who are satisfied.
Hmm.
So, yeah, so I guess I just kind of tend to move on past it.
Yeah. And for Kansas governor, you have to have a lieutenant governor to file, and we still have some time before the filing deadline. But how are you going about finding the right fit for your lieutenant governor for filing?
Yeah, I've been putting a lot of thought to that lately, making sure we make a good choice there. I'm grateful to have the insight of former governors and former lieutenant governors to help me kind of focus in that regard. And, obviously looking for someone who's, able to be an asset on the campaign trail and ultimately, someone who's willing to really, really work hard. Because, like I said,
Mhm.
I put forward a lot of effort and, I got to have somebody that's able to roll up their sleeves and, get out there and do the hard work too. So ultimately, that's what it's going to come down to.
Mhm. It is a really important decision, and also, I imagine, a very difficult one to make because you're attaching yourself to another person. So
Right,
it is
right.
kind of
Yes.
a
Yeah.
And the last question I'll ask before we move into the questions that I ask everybody at the end of the interview. And I like finishing with this question because you're doing something that very few people actually have the experience of doing, which is running for public office. So, and we often, like, as people that have not run for office, like, you look at somebody who is an elected official from like the outside looking in and kind of just form opinions on what that must be like or what that person must be like. Is there anything that you think people misunderstand about like, running for a public office or being an elected official?
Oh, yeah. There's a couple things. I think some people think you just put your name on the ballot and you, you know,
You're done.
and then you're done. There's so much that goes into it, in terms of, that in between that, you're knocking doors, you're raising money, you're, going to events. And if you're already an elected, you've got to keep up with that work or, whatever your day job is. So yeah, there's that. I think the other thing too that people kind of get away from, I mean, we're your neighbors, and especially on the state level or the local level, we're in your communities. And I think it's easy to kind of forget about that. And I think, kind of to the point about social media, I think people often, when they put those comments out there, kind of forget, I'm right here, right down the street, in some
I'm
cases.
a person too.
Um, and I'm in Kansas all the time. I'm right here, and like I said, you're still going to see me in the grocery store and things like that. Um, and I want people to remember too that running for office isn't something that just a select group of people should do. And the reason I say that too is because when I first ran, when I first started thinking about it, um, there were people within the establishment that were like, "Oh, Cindy, you're not connected to the right type of people to run for office." And, I mean, I'm connected to teachers and service workers and people in my community. And so ultimately, I went ahead and ran. And not only did I win in a very red area as a Democrat, I won every single precinct. And I've continued to win, as a Democrat in red areas, and the only Democrat that consistently does that, and the only one that has defeated Republican incumbents. So I want people to know that, regular people out there, regular Kansans, can step forward and do this. People who are connected to their neighborhoods, people who are connected to people who, work down the street for them. So I hope people are encouraged to run, in terms of, like I said, having those community connections instead of thinking that you've got to be connected to the establishment or you've got to be connected to certain groups of people.
It is fascinating from like I was not involved in the political realm until starting this organization 2 years ago. I'd never contacted an elected official or anybody running for office. And you have a certain stigma in your mind of like what that person probably may be. And it's really intimidating
Oh
sometimes
yeah.
to reach out to an elected official or somebody running for office. But what I've learned through this is no matter who I've talked to at levels, and sure there is an exception here or there, but that's with anything, right? That you're a normal person. We can connect on things and talk through things, and I can tell you some of the things I'm concerned about, and we can actually talk through those things, and you're available. Like we can talk, and it's not as intimidating, and you're a person too. And it's just kind of an interesting stigma, I think, that comes with being an elected official that you're a person too, and you have a life, and you're a Kansan, and you do those things. So it's just an
Yeah,
interesting perspective.
absolutely. Now, there are some with big egos and that type of thing, but yeah, like I said, a lot of us are just, regular people who are your neighbors.
hmm Yeah, and at the end of the day, the other thing that I've learned is everybody is doing what they think is right. So regardless
Sure.
of
Yeah.
your party affiliation, your opinion is that I'm doing the right thing for Kansas. You may disagree with somebody on what the approach is, but at the end of the day, like you're putting yourself through this. You're going through this process because you truly believe in your approach and what is best.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's yeah, I think that gets lost a little bit,
Yeah,
especially
I
the
agree.
higher you go in elected offices. But now we will move into the last three questions that I ask every guest or will ask every guest this season. If the race were to end tomorrow, what would you be most proud of doing just by stepping into the race for governor?
Oh, I would say, again, we've gotten people engaged who haven't been before, and or people who have been kind of apathetic about the process. That's exciting to get them to say, okay, yeah, yeah, I need to make sure I'm a consistent voter. I need to be more involved. And to me, that's what's important is to make sure that people realize the power of their voice and the power of their vote.
Mhm. And when people hear your name 5 years from now, what do you hope they associate it with?
Oh, honestly, I hope that they remember that I kept other people first, that, I wasn't looking out for my interest or the special interest groups, that, again, every bill, every, action comes down to, is this going to benefit the people of Kansas? And that's what I want them to remember.
And then the last question, which in my opinion is the most important, but why is voting important to you? And what would you say to the person that is not planning to vote in August?
Uh-oh. I love election day and voting because honestly, it's the one day we are all equal. And if you think about it, no matter your social status, where you live, I've got one vote, you've got one vote. The richest person in the United States has one vote. And like I said, it's the one day we're all equal. And I find that very, very empowering because it truly is the equalizer in our society. And, when people tell me, well, I'm not voting because, I don't think it's important or I don't think it's going to make a difference. I remind them, I said, well, maybe you're thinking that, but keep in mind, your banker's voting, your landlord is voting. Everybody else out there is voting and they're working to make sure that things are working in their interest. So you got to make sure that you vote in your interest. And again, like I said, it comes down to, yeah, election day, it's the great equalizer because we all have one vote. And to me, that's a great thing.
Mhm. And then just to touch a little bit more on the like August versus November voting, the primary versus the general election, like what would you say the importance of voting in the primary and not just some people have the stance of oh I'll just vote in November and not in the primary.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things going there. In terms of one, obviously, we've got to make sure we pick candidates in August who can win in November. And what I remind people about in August is that I'm the only candidate on the ballot that consistently wins in red districts and the only one that gets bills passed. So you got to win the race and you got to deliver results. So, like I said, that's what's important to look at because we've got to win in November. But the other thing too that's so important is, especially here in Kansas, we have an amendment on the ballot in August. So, I want to make sure that people, are focused on the fact we've got to make great choices in terms of our candidates, but we've also got to vote no on this amendment, because this amendment that's being put on the ballot is one that would change the way our Supreme Court justices are selected, and kind of like what we've seen in other states. And really what this is all about is finding, it's a way for the far right to find another path to try to defund our schools, take away access to reproductive health care, and basically remove voting rights. So big message I keep telling people is come out and vote yes for Cindy and vote no on the amendment. So got to have people out in August.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this, check your voter registration and plan to vote in the primary. Well, thank you for so much for joining us. I really enjoyed the conversation and having you on today. Thanks for joining us on the show.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really hope that you enjoyed and learned something from this conversation. Politics Not Included is hosted by the Transparent Campaign Initiative. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and if you did enjoy this show and want to see this organization continue to grow, we would really appreciate if you would consider making a donation or follow us on our social media pages. That support helps us grow as well. The links are in the show notes. Thank you.